My very first special guest is an organizational psychologist specializing in the development of emotional intelligence, otherwise known as EQ, and organizational culture. His work in neuroscience, leadership, and behavioral change have made him a sought after facilitator, coach, and speaker. My second very special guest is interested in pioneering new ways of achieving collective flourishing and group cohesion through the powerful vehicles of companies and organizations. His personal purpose statement in everything he does professionally is to realize humanity. Respectively, they are the CEO and Chief Humanizing Officer at MIGRO, which is a company on a mission to build an emotionally intelligent world by pioneering a new approach to people development and organizational well-being. They are Mark Baker and Theron Knighton. Welcome to the show, Mark and Theron. How are you?
We were both looking at each other there to see who's gonna say hi first. Great to be here.
I don't always get to do podcast interviews where I've got multiple people on the line, but I think because of your respective roles at MyGrow and your respective experiences in the industry, I really wanted to have you both on. So here we are. We're going to have fun with it.
Awesome.
But I'll get us started with this one. I'll tell you that I've been in the game a long time. You can probably see my gray whiskers if you're watching the video. And I was a manager for many, many years and working on my own leadership skills. And it was a long time before I really became aware that emotional intelligence, and we'll call it EQ from now on, was really a thing. So Mark, I wonder if you might get us started. Can you set a foundation for us? Tell us what is EQ and why it's important when we're thinking about the work we do in organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think probably a good place to start is just some of what struck me as a psychologist when I started really reading into the domain of emotional intelligence rather than just hearing about it as some ethereal construct out there that was part of the different intelligences. And a couple of things that might be interesting is firstly the what it is. It seems to be more a composite set of competencies that are quite pliable. The research seems to show quite clearly that these are competencies that can be developed. It is classified as an intelligence for a few specific reasons, one of which is that it actually can develop with age. So, I certainly look at my 1-year-old and 3-year-old at home and see an inability to regulate emotions, which for some people can persist, into later years in life, but for most people seems to improve through age. Another characteristic that's quite interesting is that it can be developed by implementing specific techniques. And so in that way, it's categorically different to something like cognitive intelligence, which seems to plateau at a certain age and stay reasonably similar within a certain bound of variance. And so I like to think of, cognitive intelligence a little bit more like bones. They kind of, it increases to a certain age and then it gets relatively set. Where emotional intelligence or the competencies in the domain of EQ seem to be a little bit more pliable based on implementing techniques. And so I think of them a little bit more like muscles. You can actually develop them. They certainly correlate with age. So I'm certainly stronger than my 1-year-old, literally just because of my age. But if I had to go to gym and do certain exercises over time, I would become stronger and stronger in those muscles. So that's certainly something interesting. Another interesting thing is just how to differentiate it from something like personality. There's a lot of discussion in the academic literature about the overlap between personality and emotional intelligence. Some would say, in fact, that they are almost synonymous. But what struck me in reading a little more deeply about it is that personality is really just trying to identify tendencies in behavior, where emotional intelligence is really trying to identify competencies. And whereas personality is, again, something that seems to be reasonably set, not fixed, but reasonably, these tendencies are something that we tend to do in our behavior. What I love about this domain of EQ is because its focus is on competencies that can be developed by implementing techniques. It really is this psychosocial domain of who we are that can be improved by implementing specific techniques. So I find it a very exciting domain to be involved in.
I think that it's also very important to point out that all of these things that we've been talking about so far definitely show up in the workplace dynamic. So the amount of cognitive intelligence we have, depending on the nature of the job role, that's going to be an important consideration. For example, it shows up a lot in selection. The same is true when it comes to personality. Personalities clash sometimes, or they work together harmoniously sometimes. But I love what you're pointing out, Mark, about emotional intelligence being a competency. And it's really good news for those of us who had very little of it when we were first getting started, that we can actually go to the equivalent of a gym and work on it and get better. So that's pretty good. And I think I love that you brought the psychologist angle here, but I want to shift us over a little bit into some of the applied stuff too. And Theron, I'll get your take on this one. I talk to a lot of business leaders, and almost, all of them focus really on business outcomes, right? So my question is, when you think about emotional intelligence and the relationship between that and all the alphabet soup we have around KPIs and OKRs and BHAGs and all this great stuff, all the
All the
business
different
results we
letters.
care about. Yeah. So what's the relationship between EQ and those sorts of business outcomes?
There's a very strong relationship, to put it plainly. There's a lot of research around the impact of EQ on all of those different acronyms and abbreviations. And depending on which research you read, you will see all the numbers. You will see 48% this, 92% that. And there really is a lot. And I can throw out a lot of numbers. There's an impact on each aspect, I guess, of how human beings work together, and therefore the outputs that come from that. I think my first response, though, it might be better to lay a bit of a conceptual foundation around, if KPIs and OKRs are outputs, if this is like, we're looking at, are we going to hit this thing that we're trying to accomplish? I think so often, as you say, there is an emphasis placed by senior leaders on those outputs, but of course outputs only come from inputs, don't they? And there's a lot of inputs that are required in the complexity of business. And I think very often there is a naivety as to what those inputs are. So in the world of operations, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on what tools are being used to be able to increase efficiency, save time, save money. There's emphasis on processes and SOPs and let's make this work as well as we can. Let's build collaboration through this tool or that tool. And there's a lot of emphasis placed, therefore, on system efficiency. And sometimes people forget that actually one of the other really important, perhaps even the more important input is the people who are responsible for executing on that vision, who need to actually implement the strategy. And we like to throw out what we call a people value equation, where we say there's this myth in the world of work that if you get the right strategy, it will equal value in the market. And yes, simply speaking, that's true, but there's a very important variable to the left of that equal sign. It's actually strategy multiplied by people, and in particular the ability of the people to work well together collaboratively. That's what's going to unlock value. And just like with every equation that has a multiplication in it, if you have really good positive strategy and then a negative when you get to the multiplied by people, well, you're not going to be actually seeing the value that you want to see on the other side of that equation. And in terms of the impact of EQ, to come back to your question, what does the literature say? What does the research say? There's two sides to it. The one side is the benefit of EQ, and the other side is what the lack of it will do. So if you look at a construct like workplace incivility, which is in many ways a result of a lack of emotional intelligence, the ability to manage yourself and interact effectively with others. When there is a lack of that, you see passive aggression, you see all sorts of kinds of behaviors that actually work against the strategy, work against the people who are trying to implement on the strategy. And there's a lot of clear numbers there too. Things like 13% of a manager's time goes to mitigating the effects of workplace incivility. But if you can inject EQ into it, I mean, the studies are anything from 35 to 85% of actual managerial effectiveness is as a result of EQ. And that's the flip side to the workplace incivility. So the impact is huge. And I guess our encouragement to anyone who is perhaps, sympathetic to your podcast and the kinds of stuff that you deal with here around, the people side of leadership, is to remember that's a very important input, is the caliber of the people themselves and and their ability to make good on the processes and to actually be able to use the tools effectively that an organization has. And if you can get that right with the people, well, then you start seeing benefit not just from the people, but also from the tools, also from the processes. They become better than they would be. And one of the things we often see is that, sorry, I'm going on and on here, last comment. One of the things we often see is that if a system works well, it doesn't mean it will accomplish what it needs to just because the system itself works well. The people themselves can hamper that. But even if a system doesn't work well and the people themselves work well together, well, they'll make a plan. They'll make a plan with bubble gum and shoelaces and sticky tape and whatever needs to happen to actually see that value in the market. But without that team cohesion, without that collective emotional intelligence, without high relational capital and equity, you're just wasting your money on processes and system effectiveness.
Yeah, and I think that as the nature of work has changed, it's become a lot more collaborative. Now we've shifted to remote and hybrid formats. Like the people dynamic is constantly, and it seems more rapidly than ever, evolving. And where we see lapses in emotional intelligence, then we're starting to see more friction, I would say, within the gears of even a well thought out strategy and execution and planning and these things. So considering all of the importance though, Theron, I'm going to keep with you for a second here. It seems to me like we got a problem here, because when I see research from the American Management Association, for example, says that people who work for managers really want to see empathy from those managers. Or when I talk to post-pandemic and Gen Z workers in particular, they're looking to experience something like belonging at work, and they're not always getting it. And then finally, the World Economic Forum, you brought this to my attention when they talk about EQ, talking about it as a critically scarce skill. So Theron, when you think about this, if we need EQ and it has such an impact on it, why aren't we getting it more often?
Yeah, great question. It's one that the answer to it is one that I guess infuriates us. We're on this mission to build an emotionally intelligent world, and we're evangelists really for the benefits of what it unlocks in your own personal life, intrapersonally, what it unlocks interpersonally, what it unlocks for groups, organizations. And sometimes it feels like we're banging our head against a brick wall because we can see the answer. We have the research. There's, as I said earlier, so much research around this. And I think the answer simply comes down to human nature. When things are tough, and things have been more and more tough. We were chatting with a partner in our network recently who said, COVID wasn't the problem. COVID was just the start of the infection. And we're really beginning to see the organ failure now that's coming as a result of that infection that spread. And human nature will take the easy way out, which is often the maladaptive coping mechanism, which is focused on current state. What I'm feeling right now, what I'm experiencing right now needs to be dealt with. So let me go have a smoke, it's such a classic example. Let me, turn to the bottle, to use the classic trope from movies or whatever. But it's not just in the personal life, it's in work as well. No, we're going to pull money from the people budget. We're going to put it towards marketing, or we're going to do what we think will deliver results right now. It's a current threat, current focus, but that often comes at the detriment of a future state of health and flourishing, which is what adaptive coping mechanisms are looking at. And you see this in EQ as well. If you just take one of the EQ sub-skills of assertiveness and look at the behaviors around the maladaptive behaviors instead of assertiveness. If you're not assertive, you may be passive, you may be aggressive, you may be passive-aggressive. And all three of those are not dealing with the discomfort right now maturely for future gain and growth. They're looking at the discomfort right now for how can I win right now. If I'm aggressive, it's because I want my way right now. If I'm passive aggressive, it means I don't know how to deal with this head on, so I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to poison it slowly. I'm going to do it behind their back. I'm going to gossip. I'm going to roll my eyes, whatever it is. All of these things undermine the future state, right? The health of the future state. Whereas assertiveness is the willingness to say, okay, this might be uncomfortable, but I need to address this. I need to speak to this person right now. And if you can do that well, you're building healthy future state. Now, Now, to come back to your question, why don't we get this? Well, it's hard. It's very hard to do that. It's much to just for the maladaptive coping mechanism. It's up to do what's simpler and easier, to run away from maturity and to just fall back on our defaults. And I know it might sound overly simplistic, but I honestly do think that's really at the heart of it. And then of course one other dynamic that's so often the people who hold the purse strings, who hold the decisions, they don't necessarily recognize the human side of as I was saying earlier, the human side of the inputs that need to go in to actually see value on the other side. Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm just reminded of the difference between the root and the fruit, and so often in organizations there's a sense of we want to buy and pay for and get the fruit that we want to see right now. Crucial conversations, we need to have crucial conversations, so let's put everyone through the crucial conversations, training, or the whatever stress management training, send everyone through a mindfulness thing. And those are all very important things to do. Definitely send people through those things. But part of the problem is that the root of being able to effectively live out some of those things lies, for the most part, in the domain of emotional intelligence competencies. And an example might be, for someone to go and hold or facilitate a crucial conversation, if they are triggered and their amygdala is firing on a fight, fright, freeze, or appease response, their early childhood is being triggered, and the frontal lobe is literally just shutting down because this person is facing like an internal trigger that is causing the emotional centers of the brain to override the frontal lobes. It's going to be very difficult, almost impossible, for that person to facilitate a crucial conversation in a helpful way. And so where is the value? Is the value in the fruit? We've sent someone through a training program, now they know how to have a crucial conversation. Or is the value in the root of developing these EQ competencies and being able to regulate their emotion and their emotional triggers so that they can appropriately facilitate whichever conversation is most appropriate to be had? And so in the context of assertiveness, like Theron was talking about, often we find that a framework, a brilliant framework like crucial conversations, will be imputed into an organization so that managers and leaders can be more assertive. And millions will be spent on building the ability to hold and facilitate crucial conversations, but very little investment will go into the root competencies of emotional regulation, of understanding triggers, of interpreting and reinterpreting micro expressions, and that's really the root that we're after, is how do we develop those competencies? How do we rewire the neurological realities that people have in the emotional centers of the brain so that these wonderful other frameworks, Shem, I'm picking on crucial conversations, I think, because it's just so prolific in some of the organizations we're working with at the moment, so that some of those wonderful frameworks can actually be effectively lived out. And I would say that is something of a mistake that's being made in the investment that companies are making, is they're investing in the fruit and not investing quite as much in the root constructs that will make the fruit possible.
I think it makes total sense. And I think, Theron, you used the term defaults. And I think that what we don't appreciate a lot of times is every one of our employees has had a different background, different set of experiences, different core beliefs, different everything. And then they come into this mix where we put them in a very dynamic and sometimes quite often challenging business environment. And then we get all these defaults just smashing into each other like bumper cars, versus not treating the symptoms and not, just focusing solely on the fruit, like you're saying, Mark, but going and saying, can we put in a little bit of effort and really get to the core of what's happening in terms of our dynamic and the way that we regulate ourselves and the way we interact with one another. And Mark, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat here for a second. And I just had to share this observation of mine. So I'm teaching this class over at Boston College, and it's all about self-awareness. And so we include EQ and PI as well for behavioral awareness and these types of things. But specifically in pursuit of EQ, I wanted to mention that I found this resource from Daniel Goleman, who's one of the titans, of course, of emotional intelligence. But in an HBR article, he had said this, and I'll just read it real quick. Senior executives don't often give self-awareness the credit it deserves when they look for potential leaders. And Goleman went on and he talked about how they may attribute, if a manager's willing to be vulnerable, for example, it could trigger a lack of respect. Or if they go to those places, they might say, if they're talking about feelings in the workplace, then that's wimpiness. So Goleman was very concerned about this, and I can understand why. But Mark, my question for you is, what advice do you have when it comes to these executives? How should they be thinking about EQ among, let's say, their level down leaders who they may be putting responsibilities on or looking to for promotion?
I'd say the best lens to think of it through is in terms of what is going to cause people to work most effectively together. I would say that is going to lead to the best organizational outcomes possible, rather than behaviors that are going to cause people to work less effectively together. And so let's take, for example, you mentioned empathy or vulnerability or the display of emotional care or concern for others. And, if you imagine, this is a regular occurrence in the clients that we work with. You'll have a senior executive that will, on a Friday afternoon, phone a single mom, the sole breadwinner, and demand that on Monday morning, they deliver on a particular outcome. Now, neurologically, we know that the kind of anxiety and stress that is going to cause for that mom, if her job's on the line, is not only going to cause her frontal lobe to shut down, and so her thinking ability is going to be diminished. It's also going to lead to other downstream emotions, anger, resentment, that will cause, Theron was citing some of the studies earlier. He didn't give too many of the stats on it, but it will cause downstream behaviors that will, regardless of how wonderfully lovely this single mom is, will cause behaviors that will be the quintessential spanner in the works, the ultimate disengagement, employee that is disengaged. And we see this in research across even the most well-intentioned people, that ultimately they get to a point where, and we saw it in the Great Resignation around the world in lockdown, people starting to say, I want my quality of life to mean more than even my employment. And the Great Resignation in COVID was actually an indicator in countries where, this is what made it so profound, in countries where the unemployment rates were quite high. People weren't saying, I'm leaving this job. People were saying, I don't care if I don't have a job, as long as I don't have to put up with this anymore. And so what these managers will, without even knowing how to calculate it, there will be a sluggishness in the work of people. There will be the inability to go above and beyond, which they won't be able to calculate. We see the opposite of it true in organizations where there is empathy and vulnerability. And a leader like that might say, oh my word, how can I help this with some of the dynamics in your private life? Because I'm feeling vulnerable, because if we don't get this delivered on Monday, I don't know what's going to happen to my job. How can we make this work? And what we start seeing is leaders that lean more towards the empathetic side of things, more towards vulnerability, more towards having care and concern for the people that are working for them. What we find is actually there is an upward spiral in employee engagement and an ability for people to want to work for those kind of leaders. Then we do see in the downward spiral of toxic leadership practices, where there lacks empathy, there is no psychological safety, there's no regard for people's private lives. And you alluded to it earlier, Matt. You just hopped over it by saying, in this whole remote working environment and blended working and blended learning, that same mom is actually doing her work, if there's a remote working culture, around the same table that she's having dinner with those kids. And so now suddenly that resentment that she would be carrying around her private life, work life, that used to be separate, is now literally happening. Probably she's working at the dining room table where she's going to have dinner with her kids, while she's thinking of this uncaring, unempathetic leader who's trying to somehow use, his power to get her to deliver something on Monday morning. I think it's naive. And so the work world, and I mean, you guys are on point with this in terms of PI and the work that's happening there, is that the human side of business is starting to show greater fruit than the systems and processes and bureaucracy that was part of an era that unfortunately is bygone. And so what we are seeing is that as leaders increase in empathy, increase in authenticity, increase in their ability to be vulnerable, we see an increase in things like employee engagement. We see an increase in psychological safety. We see an increase in the ability for people to think innovatively or to be front-footed and proactive in the way that they deal with the work environment. We see an increase in number of working hours in remote work because people aren't using their proverbial middle fingers to just say, I'm working remote with my camera off because my camera's not working today. Actually, what people are doing is they're saying, hey, this guy's empathetic. He cares about my life. He cares about my future. He's vulnerable. He's another human. And people love working with humans. And so just to summarize, I think I would say, there is a new reality that the world of work has sensed for a while and is now living into. And the future belongs to those who will interact in a very human way as leaders, which involves empathy and mutual vulnerability.
So Theron, Mark's laid out a very compelling case for why we need emotional intelligence in our organizations. But earlier we were talking about how we don't always have it. So I'm encouraged to go all the way back to the top, that it's a little bit more like a muscle, that we can practice it. But my question for you, Theron, is what are some of the ways that individuals and teams can then go about developing that type of EQ muscle? Like, what are some practical things they can do if they want to start moving toward that vision that Mark just laid out for us?
Yeah, I think just to underline, bold, italicize, capitalize the line again, that it is a muscle or a set of muscles. And there are some aspects of EQ that you can develop through knowledge. I think self-awareness is a good example. Some people do or don't put that into the construct of EQ, depending which model you use. But if you enter into a conversation humbly wanting to learn, then information itself, that can actually grow your self-awareness, your EQ in that capacity. But for pretty much nearly everything else, it has to develop through exercise. Growth comes from exercise, not information. And the field of positive psychology, the field of emotional intelligence, drawing very heavily from the field of neuroscience and neuropsychology, has understood for a long time now that the way to actually develop these skills is to rewire the actual physicalness in your brain. It happens at the cellular level, just like it's happening in your biceps when you're doing your bicep curls or your push-ups or whatever. There's something happening with the fibers of those muscles themselves that is growing them. Now, in the same way, EQ development is physiological. You have to do exercises. They're not exercises with weights. They're exercises with thoughts. They're exercises with breathing. They're exercises that change to go back to this word we were saying earlier, your default response patterns. You have these neural pathways developed over a whole life, which is, your life is a psychological reality or realities that give you frameworks for how you see yourself, how you engage. And the only way to change those is exercises. So there's a foundation to actually finally get to the answer to your question. The field of positive psychology has a whole lot of these exercises. There's all sorts of things you can do. In the world of stress management, just simple breathing exercises regulate your heart coherence, which unlocks different ways of thinking. It helps to bring calmness. They're practical tools like that. The meditation, mindfulness. There's skills there. There's tools there. We use in our processes. We use techniques like 3 good things, which this is a phenomenal technique that a team can use. It doesn't take any rocket science. It's a very simple 2-step process. which you can find out more about online. Martin Seligman and some colleagues. They're the authors of this technique, and it's essentially focusing on good things that have happened in your day, and then spending the time to articulate what made it possible. Why were they able to happen? And when you do that, you dig deeper than just what's good in your life. You dig towards relationship. You dig towards gift. You dig towards, the things that are the opposite of entitlement. And what that does is it starts to build optimism, positivity, gratitude, and optimism in particular is a very powerful EQ skill. So you practice a technique like this. You actually do it. You diarize it, put it in your journal. Or if you're a team, you do this as a team. You actually talk through what's a good thing that happened in our department this week. Okay, I mean, we do it every Friday. Here, in South Africa, we I don't know what cultures are like there where you are, but in our context, in our office, we eat together every day. And on a Friday, we do weekly wins. We talk about, weekly wins, and it's so baked into our culture now. Even this 3 good things technique is baked in there, that what ends up happening is you talk about the weekly wins, but then you end up saying, thanks, Janet, thanks, Peter, for how you dived in and helped with that. So you're unpacking what made it possible. That's just one example. There's practicing signature strengths. You can go Google that. There's the ABCDE technique. There's the giving praise technique. There's all sorts of things that you can do that become the sit-ups, the push-ups, the bicep curls, the running, whatever the exercises are in the world of physical fitness as an analogy. Those are the exercises to rewire your brain, to change the default way of thinking, so that instead of your first thought being in the business, context, in your meeting with your boss, instead of your first thought being, oh, this guy's such a jerk. Of course he's probably not even listening to what I have to say. If your neural pathways have been framed that way because that's the way you've engaged with a boss in the past, that's how they've engaged. Well, you can change that by learning to, give the benefit of the doubt, or the leader themselves can change that by learning how to pay attentive attention towards you. And when you start doing that, you change the paradigms of how you engage. So yeah, there's a lot. You can just Google EQ techniques.
Yeah, it's good that it's encouraging to know that while there are gaps because we don't always give it the prominence that it deserves, the fact that if we develop a habit of using these, what I'm hearing are simple exercises and techniques that don't take a lot of time, they don't take a lot of effort, but they are important, and they're ways they're things we can do together as a team. So yeah. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like this is a very hopeful conversation because we've highlighted the importance, but we've also highlighted there are things we can do. We're not just resigned to have unemotionally intelligent worlds and workplaces and these sorts of things. And I'll tell you that I want to give us a little bit of a shift here. I always like to end with a fun game. And this is going to be, the 3 of us are going to be a team here. And I have this game called, Are We Smarter Than AI? So I've had not cognitive intelligence, not emotional intelligence. We now have artificial intelligence going to ask us a question. Here's our trivia question. Ready? What is the largest part of the human brain responsible for higher order functions like thought, language, and emotion? Largest part of the human brain. What is our team answer, I guess you would call it? What do you think? An audience, you can lock in your answer at home if you're playing along. Which one do you want to offer a guess here? What do you think?
Are you pointing at me, Mark?
Yeah, I see that. I see you pointing at Theron. What do you think?
Shucks, I mean, Mark's the trained psychologist here. The largest part of the brain, I would say, is the rational brain, the neocortex. But the emotional centers of the brain,
you know too much.
I'm going
to go with that first answer, which was neocortex. Let's see what it says. It's probably too specific. You're close, but not quite. While the neocortex is a significant part of the brain, it's not the largest. Largest is the cerebrum, divided into 2 hemispheres, responsible for most of our higher order functions. See, they took it up a little. That's fine. Okay. All good. But I tell you, that was a ridiculous question. I'm going to ask you actually a very beneficial question, which is for you, Mark, and for Theron. Where can my audience go to learn more about you and about MIGRO?
I wonder what AI would say about that.
I still don't know. By the way, are we smarter than AI? Did we win?
I think we won. Yes, we definitely won. We're definitely more emotionally intelligent than AI, so we win.
True. That.
Tell Elon that we beat it. I'd say it depends on who the listener is. If it's an individual just wanting to develop their own emotional intelligence, they can go straight to migro.me, MIGRO.me, and they can sign up for a free trial there. I think we'll probably put a free trial in the podcast notes. So that's for individuals. I think in terms of corporates, there's a number of things that people might be interested in solving for. If it is to, have a look at the kind of business case and the shiftability of emotional intelligence and the return on investment, they could potentially do a human impact audit. This is a fantastic online tool that can help businesses to calculate the return on investment of doing things like EQ development. And I think it speaks there into a number of the stats that you were alluding to earlier, just to calculate some of the unseen costs of these psychosocial factors. So that's another one.
In fact, sorry,
Theron, do you want to chime in?
Can I just jump in quick to say, if people are interested in a more numbers heavy answer to one of your earlier questions of what's the connection, the literature review and the summary in that human impact audit report is incredible. There's so much in there. It's a bit of a catch-all for the impact of EQ, and a catch-all for the impact of the lack of EQ, and what it does. And there's lots of numbers and percentage signs in that document. So do go there. Thanks, Mark.
Maybe the last thing, Matt, is, some of the listeners might be interested in doing a bit of an audit on the methodologies that they are using to develop their leaders. And we've got consultants that can help with that. It's a framework that just audits to what degree the behavioral change programs align with some of the neuroscience. And again, we can put a link in the chat pane, not in the chat pane. We can put a link in the podcast notes for those who might be interested in something like that. So those would be on the corporate side, I think, a good starting point.
Awesome. I love that call out that some people listening might be individuals and say, I want to work on myself. And some are like, I'm responsible for a team or an entire company. And so as Mark mentioned, I'll have all those links for you in the show notes, listeners. So you're only one click away from connecting with Mark Theron, with MIGRO, and doing what you want to do. So Mark and Theron, thank you so much for being with me today. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge all about building an emotionally intelligent world.
Thank you.
Cheers, Matt. So great to be here with you again. And Theron, always great being alongside you.